July 10th, 1943. Just before dawn. Gela, southern coast of Sicily. The horizon was turning gray, and the first rays of sun painted the Mediterranean in strokes of gold. But the beauty was lost on the men of the 1st Infantry Division. They had just hit the beach under cover of darkness, part of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Hitler's fortress Europe. Private First Class Harold "Red" Beeson from Ohio was 19 years old. His boots were still soaked from the landing craft, and his M1 Garand felt heavier with each step inland through the muddy Sicilian fields. Behind him, Sherman tanks crawled along a dirt road. To his right, a platoon of engineers was setting up a makeshift command post beneath a crumbling stone wall. The air was tense. Every cicada chirp and every snapping twig made shoulders tighten. Somewhere beyond the olive trees, German paratroopers, hardened veterans of the Africa Corps, had dug in, but no one knew exactly where. A sharp ping cracked through the still air. Then another. A few scattered rifle shots echoed across the field. Red dropped to a knee. "Contact!" someone yelled. The Americans scrambled for cover, fanning out along the dry irrigation ditches. And then it came. The sound. That sound. It started like the tearing of canvas, but deeper, angrier. A ripping, thunderous roar that didn't sound like any machine gun Red had ever heard in training. It wasn't just loud. It was fast. Too fast. A single burst lasted a heartbeat. And in that moment, men were cut down before they could even raise their rifles. "Down! Get down!" Sergeant Kincaid shouted, dragging a radio man behind a stone fence. Dirt erupted a few feet from Red's position as bullets chewed through the field, spraying chunks of earth and wheat into the air. That wasn't a Browning. That wasn't an MG-34 either. The German gun they'd been warned about in North Africa. This was new. This was something else. The bullets came in streaks, blinding flashes from somewhere up the ridge. You didn't hear individual shots. You just heard the scream. A high-pitched, mechanical shriek that went on for half a second, then stopped, then came again, again, over and over. They said it fired 200 rounds per minute. But that didn't mean much when your buddy was hit before you even knew you were being shot at. By mid-morning, the field was littered with helmets, shattered rifles, and motionless forms. The medics moved quickly, crouched low. But in truth, there was little they could do. Limbs were gone, chests opened. You couldn't patch wounds like that. When the shooting finally stopped and the ridge was taken, Red climbed up cautiously. They found the weapon inside a camouflaged dugout, propped on a tripod with empty belts of 7.92mm casings spilling down like dead snakes. MG 42, a German prisoner muttered. MG 42. Red didn't speak German, but he didn't need to. One of the GIs stepped closer and muttered, half in awe, "Whatever that is, sounds like a damn buzzsaw." The nickname stuck. They called it Hitler's Buzzsaw. And the men who had faced it, those still alive, never forgot what it sounded like. It would haunt them from Sicily to Normandy to the forests of Belgium. July 12th, 1943. 2 days after landing at Gela, the hills near Nesemi were quiet that morning. The kind of silence that didn't sit right. Private Red Beeson and his squad had been pushing inland with the rest of the 1st Division. The plan was to take high ground overlooking the road network. Whoever controlled those roads controlled the whole southern flank of Sicily. But they weren't green anymore, not after Gela. The men moved differently now. Faces tighter, fingers twitching near triggers. They didn't walk upright across fields like they had in training. Now they hugged the earth. They understood what the MG-42 could do. Red had been paired with Corporal Joe Drayton, a Chicago dock worker who now carried the squad's bar, the Browning automatic rifle. Joe was big, solid, and quiet. His knuckles were raw from scraping across rock and dirt. He didn't say much, but when he did, men listened. "Listen," Joe whispered, raising a fist. The squad froze. Through the warm morning air came a distant rip. Short, controlled bursts. Then silence again. "It's one of them," Red said under his breath. They crept forward, flanking the rise in a slow, wide arc. Captain Sloan had drilled this into them back in Tunisia. Don't charge a machine gun. You flank it. You make it move. But that was easier said than done. The MG-42 didn't give you time to react. When it opened up, it was like someone dropped a chainsaw into a steel drum and turned the volume up past 10. You didn't hear bullets crack past. You heard nothing. And then someone next to you just wasn't there anymore. As they moved into position, Red saw it. Just above a shattered stone wall, nestled between two fig trees, a thin plume of smoke curled upward. A German team was dug in with a clear line of fire down the valley. Two-man team, gunner and loader, Joe said, peering through binoculars. Looks like they're covering the road. They waited for the signal, 3 short pops from the platoon leader's Thompson up the hill. Pop, pop, pop. Then came chaos. Red and Joe opened fire first. The bar kicked like a mule, but it laid down enough noise to startle the Germans. Someone tossed a grenade. Dirt and leaves flew. A second squad rushed in from the other side. The Germans broke. One man fled, dragging the weapon by its bipod legs. The loader fell, riddled with rifle fire. The squad moved in, fast and violent. By the time the dust settled, Red was kneeling over the MG-42, still hot, still smoking. It looked sleek, almost elegant. Streamlined steel. The barrel quick-release latch glinted in the light. The whole thing looked like it had been built by engineers who weren't just designing a weapon. They were building a tool for fear. Joe shook his head. It's like they built it to scare you before it even fires. And it did. Word spread fast through the ranks. You didn't need to see the MG-42 to feel it. You knew when it was firing. You could feel it in your chest, in your teeth. It was a sound that cut through everything. Artillery, shouting, even the roar of tanks. The sound of the buzzsaw lived in the air long after the fighting stopped. That night, the men sat around a makeshift fire, eating K-rations and watching the moon rise over the olive trees. Someone asked how many had fallen that day. No one answered. Not directly. They just stared at the fire and chewed in silence. "Back home," Red muttered. "My brother runs a lumber mill. When the saw kicks in, it kind of sounds like that." Joe nodded slowly. "Only this one's fed by hate." No one laughed. They all just stared into the dark, waiting for the sound to return, because they knew it would. Later that week, the captured MG-42 lay on a crate in the battalion aid station, next to a broken radio and a pile of canteens. Soldiers kept stopping by to look at it, like it was some kind of alien artifact. They didn't talk much, just stared, shook their heads, and walked away. Captain Sloan picked it up carefully, examining the details. The thing was deceptively light, about 25 pounds, but it looked and felt much leaner than the American Browning M1919. It had smooth, curved lines, an aggressive shark-like barrel shroud, and the cooling slots gave it a skeletal look. Brutal and beautiful all at once. "It's not just a gun," he muttered, half to himself. "It's a damn engineering marvel." The MG-42 wasn't just designed to kill. It was designed to break the rhythm of combat. It operated with roller-locked recoil, a system that allowed it to cycle faster than anything the Allies had in the field. While American gunners sent 400 to 600 rounds per minute downrange, the MG-42 more than doubled that, spitting 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. That sound, the infamous ripping cloth scream, wasn't just noise. It was tactical. It pinned men down, made them afraid to move. It broke assaults before they even started. A single gun team could control an entire sector of battlefield with a few well-placed bursts. Staff Sergeant Frank Wallace, who ran a heavy weapons platoon, watched his men practice setting up their M1909s that afternoon. It took 3 of them to carry the tripod, the gun, the ammo boxes, and the spare barrel kit. It was slow, deliberate, and clunky. He glanced at the MG-42 again. "This thing was built for war," he said, "not some workshop trophy piece. You can swap a barrel in seconds. You can break it down blindfolded. Hell, they built it to last 1,000 years." He wasn't wrong. The German philosophy behind the MG-42 was brutal efficiency. It could be mass-produced using stamped metal parts, cutting down both cost and production time. The result? Tens of thousands of MG-42s pouring into German divisions by 1943. By then, every German squad had one. Not as support, but as the centerpiece. Their tactics revolved around it. 1 gun, 2 men, 1,000 rounds of chaos. The rest of the squad? There to protect the machine gun, feed it, relocate it, or counterattack when it had done its damage. Corporal Joe Drayton said it best later that night, over black coffee and half a chocolate bar. "Back home, we fight around the rifle. Out here, they fight around that damn buzzsaw." He paused, looked at his hands, stained with grease from cleaning the bar. "Feels like we brought baseball bats to a chainsaw fight." It wasn't just the rate of fire, though. It was the sound. Allied commanders quickly realized the psychological toll it was taking. The MG-42 wasn't just killing men. It was stalling advances, delaying offensives, breaking morale. Sometimes a platoon would refuse to move forward until artillery softened the position first. In Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, the story repeated itself. GIs would be charging a hill, gaining ground, pushing through mortar fire. And then that sound would come, and everything would stop. Just the scream of steel and the thud of men hitting the ground. Years later, some veterans would say they could still hear it in their dreams. The war was changing. This wasn't a gentleman's fight anymore. This was modern warfare, fast, loud, and merciless. And the MG-42 was the soundtrack. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. At 6:33 a.m., the ramp dropped on landing craft Assault 722. Cold surf crashed over the bow, machine gun fire cracked like thunder, and the men of Easy Company, 116th Infantry Regiment, sprinted into hell. Private First Class Red Beeson was there, no longer a rookie from Ohio, but a combat-seasoned infantryman with deep-set eyes and a hollow stare. Sicily and Italy had changed him, but nothing prepared him for Omaha. The beach was wide and shallow. Wet sand turned red in minutes. Steel tank traps and Belgian gates littered the tide, twisted like broken ribs. Up on the bluff ahead, pillboxes loomed with gun barrels poking from concrete mouths. And then it came again. That sound. Rrrr, rip, 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 rip. Men dove into the surf. Some never made it past the waterline. Bullets tore through the morning mist in streaks. Sand kicked up like geysers. It wasn't just chaotic. It was surgical. You could hear it. That cold, steady rhythm. The MG-42s were working in tandem now, crossing fields of fire like invisible scissors. Red threw himself behind a section of angled steel and screamed, "Where the hell's the armor?" No one answered. Half his squad was gone. From the bluffs, German gun crews worked the MG-42s with calm precision. A gunner pulled the trigger in short bursts, 5, 6, 7 rounds. Then paused just long enough for the loader to snap in a new belt. They had rehearsed this 1,000 times. It was second nature. To the GIs on the beach, it felt like being hunted. Captain Sloan, still leading from the front after all these campaigns, crawled up behind a corpse-strewn sand dune and yelled into his field phone, "We can't move. They're chewing us up." The naval bombardment had missed its mark. The MGs were untouched, unshaken, fully operational. And as the sun climbed higher, their shadows stretched long across the battlefield. Red tried to remember his training. Crawl, move low, stay behind cover. But the fire was so dense it seemed to come from every direction. The German machine gun positions had interlocking arcs. Even when one MG-42 paused to reload or swap barrels, the others picked up the slack. Every few feet lay another fallen man. Helmets cracked. Packs smoldered. Dog tags tangled in barbed wire. Red's ears rang from the constant concussion of bullets striking nearby metal. He watched as a lieutenant tried to rally his men forward, only to be cut down mid-stride, a half-second scream swallowed by the shriek of the buzzsaw. It wasn't bravery that moved Red forward. It was rage, fury, and momentum. He gritted his teeth, grabbed the handle of a Bangalore torpedo, and crawled through the wire under a curtain of death. Boom. One MG nest silenced. Then another. The beach didn't fall in an hour. It didn't fall in 2. But by afternoon, the Americans had clawed their way inland, inch by blood-soaked inch. And when they reached the top of the bluff, Red saw the enemy weapon again. Just like in Sicily, it sat atop a steel tripod, burned black from overuse. The barrel warped slightly from heat. Shell casings were piled knee-high around the position, glimmering in the sun like brass corn husks. Next to the weapon lay the German gunner, maybe 19, maybe 20. A small entry wound under his left eye. He looked like a kid. Red stared down at the MG-42. The thing had haunted his nights for almost a year now. He didn't spit on it. He didn't curse it. He just looked at it, that perfectly built, perfectly cruel machine, and said quietly, "You did your job. But so did we." He turned away and walked inland. Behind him, the tide kept rolling in. And beside the waves, the MG-42 stood quiet for the first time that day. November 18th, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. It had been raining for days. Cold, steady, miserable. The kind of rain that crept into your bones and stayed there. Mud sucked at every boot step. Trees leaned like tired men, and the fog, thick, colorless, always shifting, never lifted. Private First-Class Red Beeson and what remained of his platoon moved silently through the pine forest, their breath fogging in the freezing air. They were a part of the 28th Infantry Division now, thrown into a brutal meat grinder on the German frontier. The Hürtgen Woods didn't make headlines like Normandy had. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, it was just death. And somewhere ahead, buried in the trees and mist, the MG-42 was waiting. Unlike in Sicily or on the beaches of Normandy, the buzzsaw in the forest wasn't shouting. It whispered. Short bursts. Careful fire. Precision. The Germans didn't need to spray rounds here. The terrain did the work for them. Visibility was maybe 20 yards. You couldn't see a man standing 5 trees away. Sound bounced off trunks and vanished into the moss. The Americans had no idea how many guns were out there. But they knew when one opened up. It always started the same. A quiet rustle. Then, A burst of automatic fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Someone screamed. Then silence again. That was the Hurtgen way. Sergeant Joe Drayton, still carrying his trusty bar, knelt beside Red under a fallen spruce. "They're not wasting ammo," he whispered. "They're tracking movement, listening for our boots." Red nodded, eyes scanning the ghost-gray woods. "Feels like we're being hunted." They were. The Germans had camouflaged their MG-42 positions with pine branches, leaves, snow, anything to disappear into the forest. They rotated gunners constantly, fired from one spot, moved to another. Every opening in the trees was a potential death trap. The Americans tried everything: flanking maneuvers, smoke screens, mortar fire. Nothing worked for long. One nest would fall, and two more would open up behind it. Captain Sloan was killed that afternoon. A single burst caught him mid-sentence as he gave orders near a tree line. He collapsed without a sound, his map fluttering into the mud like a dead leaf. They buried him in a shallow hole before dark. No ceremony, no bugle. Just a few words, and a helmet placed over the cross. Later that night, Red sat beside a cooking can, warming his hands over a tiny flame. Joe leaned back against a tree, clutching his poncho tight. "You know," Joe said, "they say the German gunners call it Bonesaw now." Red raised an eyebrow. Joe nodded slowly. "Because it cuts men in half." They didn't speak for a while after that. They just listened to the wind threading through the trees, and the faint, distant echo of a burst far off to the east. That sound again. Even when you were safe, it made your stomach tighten. And yet, the men kept moving, kept pushing forward. Not because they weren't scared, but because the guy next to them needed them to. Because if you stopped moving, you were dead. In the weeks that followed, the 28th Division lost over 6,000 men in the Hurtgen Forest. Many of them fell to mines, artillery, frostbite. But many, too many, were taken down by the MG-42. The Buzzsaw didn't care who you were, didn't care where you were from. Ohio, Chicago, Brooklyn, Kansas. If you moved into its line of fire, you were gone. Red knew that now. But he also knew this. It was just a machine, a tool, a brutal one, yes. But it couldn't move without a man behind it. And men could bleed. That meant it could be beaten. They just had to survive long enough to prove it. December 8th, 1944. Hill 400, Bergstein, Germany. The rain had turned to sleet, and the sleet had turned the hill into a muddy graveyard. Red Beeson dug deeper with his entrenching tool, fingers frozen stiff through wet gloves. His unit had been tasked with taking and holding Hill 400, a jagged outcrop that dominated the Rower River Valley. Whoever held the hill could see for miles. That meant artillery control. That meant survival. But the Germans weren't about to give it up. By dawn, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was moving up the slope under withering fire. The slope offered no cover, just slick, cold mud and shattered pine trunks. Red was assigned to support the Rangers with rifle fire and ammunition, part of a hodgepodge relief squad hastily stitched together from different outfits. And just like Hurtgen, the MG-42 was already awake. It screamed from bunkers cut into the ridge, bursts echoing across the hillside like metal thunder chained to the mountain. You could see the tracers stitch the air, angry orange lines crisscrossing the fog. Some men froze. Others charged ahead. Most crawled on their bellies, boots scraping rocks, hands raw and bleeding. Sergeant Joe Drayton was hit early. A ricochet clipped his thigh as he sprinted between shell holes. Red dragged him behind a snow-covered stump and tied off the wound with his own belt. Joe, pale but conscious, waved him off. Don't wait. That thing'll kill the whole line if it keeps going. Red nodded. He grabbed a spare belt of 30-06 and moved up. The German gunners had dug deep into the hill, reinforced bunkers, ammo crates stacked to the ceiling, overlapping fields of fire. Each MG-42 team was protected by riflemen, grenadiers, and mortar units. They weren't holding Hill 400 like a position. They were defending it like sacred ground. Every burst was disciplined, controlled. The gunners never fired longer than 3 seconds, just enough to drop men, never enough to overheat. That was the terrifying part. How calm it sounded, like they were painting with fire. By midday, the hillside was littered with bodies. The medics worked in teams of 2, moving fast, heads down. One of them, a lanky corporal from Wisconsin, paused just long enough to say, "It's not a hill. It's a meat grinder." Red knew what had to be done. He joined a flanking squad trying to hit the MG positions from the west. It meant climbing, slowly, silently, through frozen brush and snow, with every branch threatening to give away their location. At 2:47 p.m., they reached the back wall of one of the bunkers. The sergeant signaled. A grenade went in. 2 seconds. Boom. They rushed the opening. Inside was chaos, smoke, screaming. And the MG-42, still hot, barrel glowing dull red, lay spinning on the floor, its bipod bent. One of the Rangers kicked it aside. Not so tough without a trigger, man. Outside, the hillside was finally quiet. That night, Red sat near a fire pit carved into the frozen ground. Joe lay beside him, bandaged and half asleep. The Rangers had held the hill, barely. The cost had been brutal. Nearly half the men who went up never came back down. Red looked up at the stars above the ridgeline. He thought about the men behind those guns, the Germans who had manned them. Some had fought to the last round, others had surrendered with hands shaking. It wasn't just the gun that made it deadly. It was the man behind it. How long he could hold the trigger, how long he could hold his nerve. Buzzsaw or not, Red whispered to himself, every blade dulls. Then he closed his eyes, one hand resting near his rifle, and waited for the morning. December 19th, 1944. Near Bastogne, Belgium. 5th day of the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The snow came down thick and slow, softening the sounds of war. Pine trees bent under the weight, white and heavy, branches sagging like weary shoulders. But beneath that postcard silence, the men of the 101st Airborne were freezing, exhausted, and surrounded. Private First Class Red Beeson hadn't seen a supply truck in 2 days. His extra socks were soaked through, and the chocolate bar in his pocket had frozen solid. The foxhole he shared with a young replacement from Minnesota was dug into the side of a hill, barely deep enough to protect from shrapnel. The enemy was close, too close, and the MG-42 was back. It wasn't just one gun this time, it was a web. The Germans had set up a kill zone along the tree line to the east, placing multiple MG-42s in staggered nests. They waited until the paratroopers began to shift positions, then let loose. The crack of gunfire didn't build up. It exploded, a ripping, snarling sound that tore through the forest like the earth had opened up. Rip, rip, rip. Red ducked instinctively, grabbing the frozen edges of the foxhole as a stream of tracers slashed overhead. Snow burst apart in midair where the rounds hit. A man 10 feet away crumpled without a sound, his rifle still in his hands. "Can't see them," the kid next to Red yelled, fumbling for his ammo. "You're not supposed to," Red growled. "That's the point." It was classic MG-42 doctrine. The Germans weren't just using the gun to kill. They were using it to freeze the battlefield. Anyone who moved died. Anyone who stayed put became artillery bait. The Americans called for fire support. Mortars landed short, then long. It didn't matter. The guns kept firing, not in long, wild bursts like panic. No, this was practiced. Sharp, short volleys. Fire. Pause. Fire again. Always just enough to make you duck, but never enough to overheat the barrel. In the chaos, Red spotted movement, 3 figures dashing from one tree line to another, carrying what looked like ammo belts. German runners feeding the machine. Red raised his M1 Garand and fired. One man dropped. The others scattered. And then, silence. The buzzsaw stopped. Only for a second. That silence was worse than the noise, because you never knew if it meant the gun had jammed or if it was simply waiting. The platoon leader gave the order. Move now. Left flank. 2 fire teams. Red's boots slipped as he sprinted through knee-deep snow. Behind him, men yelled and stumbled, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Somewhere ahead, a single MG-42 opened up again. Just one. And Red heard the telltale click-click of its belt being reloaded. He and 3 others found a way up the flank, crawling behind logs, creeping through low brush, following a creek bed until they reached the rear of the German nest. The gunner was young, maybe 17, lips blue from cold, focused entirely on his weapon. Red didn't hesitate. One shot, then another. It was over in 2 seconds. As he stepped into the nest, he saw the MG-42 lying there, warm, hissing steam from where snow had landed on its barrel. Brass casings were piled around it like spent promises. Red stared at it, breathing hard. Same scream, same result, he muttered. The snow continued falling, slow and relentless, covering the tracks of both hunter and hunted. The MG-42 had ruled that forest for hours. But now it was silent. January 4th, 1945, somewhere outside Bastogne. The cold had let up, but only slightly. Frost still clung to every branch, and boots still crunched over ice. But the push had begun. The Americans were advancing again, and with each village they took, more German weapons were left behind, sometimes dropped mid-fight, sometimes stacked neatly by surrendering troops. Private First Class Red Beeson stood in a muddy field depot just outside a liberated farmhouse, staring down at a long wooden table filled with captured German equipment. MP-40s, Karabiner 98K rifles, Panzerfausts. But it was the MG-42 that everyone kept returning to. This one had been pulled from a bunker near the Ortha River. Still intact, still loaded. A few ordnance techs stood around it, taking notes, snapping black and white photos. One of them, a kid from Brooklyn with wire-framed glasses and hands stained with oil, looked up and whistled. Thing cycles faster than anything I've ever seen. Look at this recoil assembly. It's genius. Red didn't know the mechanics, but he understood the result. That gun held up 3 companies last week, he said, his voice flat. We called for artillery twice, and it still kept going. The tech nodded. Barrel change in under 5 seconds. Watch this. With one motion, he lifted the latch, twisted the body open, and popped the barrel loose. It hissed faintly in the cold, still warm from its last use. Red watched closely, not because he was curious, but because he knew someday someone would use this design again. Maybe in the next war, maybe on a different battlefield. The thought made his stomach twist. Back at the front, talk had started spreading. The Army was considering adopting some features from the MG-42 into American designs. Faster rates of fire, swappable barrels, lighter construction. Not to copy it, but to learn from it. Improve. They even brought captured MG-42s stateside for testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Reports came back calling it arguably the most advanced general-purpose machine gun of the war. Red wasn't surprised. He'd seen what it could do. It wasn't just a gun. It was a battlefield equalizer. With 2 men, a tripod, and 1,000 rounds, the Germans could hold a crossroads or a ridgeline for hours. They didn't need numbers, they had speed, shock, sound. He remembered watching an MG team in Italy wipe out a Sherman crew that had stepped outside for a smoke. 4 men, gone before they hit the ground. The tank was still intact, but the heart was gone. Still, he also knew its weaknesses. If you got close enough, if you could flank it. The gun's narrow firing arc and need for crew support made it vulnerable. A single grenade or a well-placed shot could end it. The gun itself was only as good as the man operating it. And by 45, many of those men were gone. Fresh German recruits, undertrained, underfed, sometimes just boys, were being thrown behind the buzzsaws. They lacked the discipline of the early war gunners. They made mistakes, fired too long, let the barrel overheat, forgot to clear jams properly. Red had seen an MG-42 explode from an overheated barrel near the Siegfried line. Killed both the gunner and the loader instantly. Even the best machine needs a steady hand. As Red watched the ordnance team finish their demonstration, he stepped back into the cold. A snow flurry began drifting down again, light and quiet. The sounds of war, for once, were far off. He knew the MG-42 would go down in history, not just for its firepower, but for the fear it carved into every man who heard it. But in that moment, Red also knew something else. It didn't win. It slowed them, hurt them, shook them, but it didn't win. They were still moving forward. And the Buzzsaw, for all its noise, was now just a captured piece of steel on a table, surrounded by American hands. January 12th, 1945. Eastern Belgium, just outside St. Vith. The snows were finally beginning to melt, and with them came the churn of retreating enemy lines. The German Ardennes gamble had failed, and now American units were pushing back, one field, one forest, one bloodied village at a time. Private First Class Red Beeson walked with his rifle slung low, his eyes constantly scanning the tree lines. The terrain had become familiar. Pine stands, mud ruts, farmhouses with the windows blown out. But what struck him most wasn't what had changed. It was what hadn't. The MG-42 still ruled the battlefield. Even as the Wehrmacht fell back, they left behind machine gun teams in ambush positions. Rear guards, snipers with belts of 7.92 millimeters draped around their shoulders like scarves. Every draw, every bend in the road carried the same threat. That sudden scream, that metallic chainsaw ripping through the air. Red had learned to listen for it. The microsecond whine before it kicked, the faint clatter of a feed tray, the hesitation between bursts. The green troops still froze up when they heard it. But the veterans? The men like Red, like Joe Drayton, when he wasn't recovering from the leg wound. They'd learned something the Germans hadn't expected: how to move under it. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. You waited for the pause between bursts. You tracked the sound and plotted its arc. And most importantly, you didn't bunch up. Every man spaced out, 5 yards between, 10 if you could. There was a rhythm to it now. The MG-42 fired, and 2 men would rush forward. It fired again, and 2 more would leapfrog past. It became a grim dance. Fire, move, like skipping between lightning strikes. Red had also learned to trust his ears more than his eyes. In thick fog or in broken villages, sound was king. You could hear the buzzsaw before you could see its flash, and sometimes that second or two meant everything. By now, Allied tactics had started evolving too. Officers issued earplugs to keep men from panicking at the weapon's sound. Squad leaders carried smoke grenades specifically to blind machine gun nests. Flamethrower teams were brought up earlier. Even the artillery boys had learned to triangulate the MG-42 by its signature sound, calling in fire within minutes of its first burst. One afternoon, outside the town of Prum, Red's squad was pinned by an MG-42 dug into the second story of a wrecked hotel. The road was exposed, no cover, no escape. The buzzsaw pinned them flat for almost 15 minutes. Then the radio man got through to the 105s a mile back. 30 seconds later, a shell screamed overhead. The hotel vanished in a thunderclap. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the second floor, and no more MG-42. Red didn't smile. He just stood up and kept moving. Because by now, he understood. You didn't beat that gun with rage. You beat it with patience, with timing, with fire discipline, with American stubbornness. Later that evening, as the platoon warmed their hands over a fuel can fire, a young replacement leaned over and asked Red, "Is it true they called it Hitler's buzzsaw?" Red nodded. "Yeah. We called it that the first time we heard it, back in Sicily." The kid hesitated, then asked, "What did it sound like?" Red didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his face still streaked with dried sweat and dirt. "It sounded like fear," he said finally. But it wasn't unbeatable, just a man pulling a trigger. The kid didn't respond. He just looked down at the dirt, maybe thinking about what was ahead. Red leaned back, unwrapped the last piece of chocolate from a K-ration box, and broke it in half. He handed the other piece to the kid without a word. Because tomorrow, they'd probably hear it again. And tomorrow, they'd face it again. March 30th, 1945. South of Kassel, Germany. The air smelled like spring, broken earth, rain, and diesel fumes. Green buds were pushing through the mud. Crows circled above a burned-out Panzer on the roadside. War was still raging, but it was changing. The German lines were collapsing. Towns were surrendering faster than they could be occupied. Road signs were riddled with bullet holes, but few guns remained behind them. Private First Class Red Beeson stood beside a hedgerow, staring across a wheat field that had just been cleared. Another ambush site, another machine gun nest, another MG-42. Only this time, it hadn't fired. The crew had fled or surrendered or been too scared to use it. Red stepped forward, boots crunching over spent brass and shattered helmets. The field was quiet except for the wind moving the grass, and there it was. Propped up awkwardly on a tree stump, the once feared weapon, now silent. The MG-42 looked almost like it was waiting for someone. But its belts were gone. The barrel, cold. He approached slowly, as if half expecting it to wake up and scream again. It didn't. He ran his hand along the metal. Smooth, precise, still oiled despite the chaos around it. German engineering to the last. Nearby, a German boy in a tattered Wehrmacht tunic sat on the ground, hands on his head, no more than 16 years old. He didn't even look up as the Americans passed. He just stared at the earth in front of him. A medic handed the boy a canteen and said in quiet German, "It's over." And it was. The war in Europe wouldn't officially end until May. But for Red, and for the thousands of infantrymen who had faced that gun again and again from Sicily to the Siegfried Line, this moment meant something. The MG-42, the gun that had once seemed unstoppable, was finally out of places to hide. Later that evening, Red and Joe Drayton, now walking with a limp but back in the fight, sat on a pile of sandbags near the battalion HQ. Joe lit a cigarette with a shaky hand and exhaled slowly. "Remember when we thought that thing was invincible?" he asked, nodding toward the latest captured MG-42 leaning against a fence post. Red nodded. It was. For a while. Joe took another drag. "Still hear it in my sleep. Probably always will." Red didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all heard it. That sound had followed them through fields, towns, rivers, mountains. It had taken their friends, their leaders, their rookies. It had ruled their fear. But not anymore. Now it was being loaded onto trucks. Studied, dismantled, disarmed. Red looked at the weapon one last time. No hate, no satisfaction, just a strange kind of respect. For the men who had fought behind it, and for the men who had charged through its fire. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that had shaped the war. It was the men who kept going anyway. As darkness fell over the valley and the stars came out, Red leaned back, shut his eyes, and listened to the silence. Real silence. The kind that only comes when the last burst has been fired, and no one is left to pull the trigger.